Hello everyone, welcome to the 17th episode of The Fur Trade in Human Civilization. We're talking about my book titled The Fur Trade in Human Civilization. Today we'll be going over section 4.6, Beverages in the Age of Exploration. We'll be discussing tea and coffee and its impact on the world. This is the last section of chapter 4, and we'll be going over chapter 5 afterwards. So the age of exploration marked a new chapter in human civilization and transformed the lifestyles. Tea and coffee, popular European drinks, had long-lasting and profound impacts on the economy, industry, daily life, politics, and culture. So first, let's start by talking about tea. The tea plant originates from southwestern China, especially in the Sichuan or Yunnan. Tea refers to the beverage made from the processed leaves of the tea plant, and modern tea is categorized into 6 main types based on the processing method: green, white, yellow, oolong, black, and dark tea. According to Gu Yanwu's Rizhilu, the tea drinking culture was brought to the Central Plains after the Qing state conquered the Shu region around the late Warring States period. However, tea drinking had already become fashionable in China, and by the 4th century, the demand for tea had outstripped the supply of wild tea leaves, leading the Chinese to start cultivating tea trees. Ancient people already recognized the antibacterial and anti-inflammatory properties of tea leaves. Modern research has confirmed that the tannic acid in tea can kill bacteria responsible for diseases such as cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. Consequently, even tea brewed with water that had not been boiled can disinfect and purify drinking water, reducing mortality rates. Now let's talk about the tea cultures in China and Japan. In 780 AD, the Chinese scholar Lu Yu published the Classic of Tea. This book provided detailed descriptions of tea cultivation, processing, brewing, and tasting methods. Lu Yu recorded numerous details related to tea, including the effects of various types of tea leaves, the impact of different types of water in tea brewing, and even the steps for boiling water. Tea competitions and tea discussions were popular in the imperial court, where the emperor would drink tea prepared with special spring water, which later evolved into tribute tea. Tang Dynasty people believed that the tea could clear the mind, cure headaches, and combat fatigue, relieve hangovers and digestion, reduce anxiety, and detoxify the body. Chinese tea culture further flourished in the Song Dynasty. By the Southern Song period, tea had become an essential beverage across all social strata. In 1206, a poet noted that many tea houses were present in the markets, where everyone, regardless of status, drank tea. Scholars genuinely believe that tea became a common commodity in the social economy starting in the Tang Dynasty and flourished in the Song Dynasty. Although it did not accomplish the same scale of profitability as salt and iron, tea deeply penetrated the daily lives of the general populace. To facilitate preservation and transport, tea leaves in the Tang and Song dynasties were made into tea cakes, which were crushed into powder and then when used. The founding emperor in the Ming Dynasty, Zhu Yuanzhang, mandated the use of whole leaf tea as a tribute to save the costs associated with making tea cakes. Ming Dynasty scholar and official Su Guangqi, in his complete book on agriculture, highlighted the ability of tea to purify the spirit of the drinker, provide profits for tea growers, and contribute to national prosperity and fiscal improvement. It is widely accepted that Buddhist monks spread the practice of tea preparation and drinking to Japan, where tea consumption began in the 8th century. In 1191, the Buddhist monk Myeon Esai, who had studied in China, introduced tea to Japan and wrote Kisa Yojoki, drinking tea for health. And now let's talk about tea consumption and trade in Europe. In the early 16th century, the Portuguese were the first Europeans to arrive in China. By the 1550s, Europeans had become aware of Chinese tea, though it was initially purchased in small quantities and brought back to Europe as personal items. In 1610, Dutch ships first transported tea as a commercial product to Europe, and in the 1630s, tea had spread from the Netherlands to France, and by the 1650s, it had reached England. In 1699, British officials' tea import volume was only 6 tons, but by 1799 it had risen to 11,000 tons, with tea prices falling to 1/20th of their 1699 levels. By the late 18th century, people of all social classes in Britain, regardless of wealth, could drink tea daily. In the 1660s, the British East India Company began purchasing tea from the Dutch in Southeast Asia and presenting it to the English king. In 1669, the British East India Company, for the first time in its corporate capacity, purchased a shipment of tea from Java and imported it to Britain. The 18th century coincided with the British Industrial Revolution, and tea drinking suited the nature and schedule of the new factory work. Workers had tea breaks, and drinking tea to refresh and energize themselves increased labor productivity. Additionally, tea's antibacterial properties help purify drinking water, and in the 1730s, as more people drank tea, the incidence of dysentery in London began to decline. Tea not only benefited drinkers but also lowered infant mortality rates, as the antibacterial tannic acid in tea dissolved in breast milk, improving overall human survival quality. Tea consumption also spurred demand for teaware, mostly ceramics, and sugar, creating new market demands and expanding market trade. Britain's heavy consumption of tea, which was exclusively produced in China, led to efforts to reduce costs. As early as 1788, the British East India Company hired experts to find solutions, and in 1822, the Royal Society offered a reward for successful tea cultivation in the British West Indies, the Cape of Good Hope, South Wales, and Indonesia. In 1840, the Assam Company began large-scale tea cultivation, employing many Chinese tea workers as they could find, but production increased slowly. It was not until 1851 that the Assam Company began to turn a profit. By the 1860s, the British incorporated the technological and managerial achievements of the Industrial Revolution in the tea production. Measures such as rational plantation density, workers' shift scheduling, and refined division of labor, and the introduction of machinery significantly reduced the cost of British-produced tea. By 1872, the cost of producing tea in Britain equaled that of Chinese tea, and by 1913, the cost of British tea production had dropped to one-fourth of that of Chinese tea. Tea consumption in China, Korea, and Japan had a history of over 1,000 years, but did not have a significant impact on the world before the 17th century. However, the immense enthusiasm for tea consumption that arose in Europe, particularly in industrially advanced Britain, was a product of global trade following the Age of Discovery and the new demands of a new stage in human civilization's development. Compared to medieval Europe's use of alcohol as a beverage, tea and coffee were recognized for their stimulating and invigorating effects. This helped represent a pursuit of physical and mental health, a desire to stay alert, and a craving for active communication and interaction. Development of this phenomenon had its process. The Age of Discovery at the end of the 15th century, with nearly 2 centuries of accumulation and preparation, followed significant scientific progress such as achievements of Hooke, Newton, and Leibniz at the end of the 17th century. Just as the tea cultures of China and Japan evolved in their respective historical contexts, tea found renewed significance in Enlightenment-era Europe. It played a vital role in the new social and industrial life, symbolizing the integration of traditional practices into a modern industrialized society. Now, let's shift our discussion of tea to coffee. Coffee refers to the beverage made from brewing roasted and ground coffee beans. It is the highest-selling beverage in the global hot drinks market, and unroasted green coffee beans are one of the world's largest agricultural export commodities and among the most traded agricultural products. So first, let's talk about the spread and trade of coffee. The earliest records of coffee spreading from East Africa to the Arabian Peninsula and being consumed date back to the 15th century. Sufi scholars on the Arabian Peninsula use the leaves of the native Yemeni plant khat as a stimulant to stay awake during nighttime meditation. However, khat became scarce on the Arabian Peninsula in the latter half of the 15th century, leading to the use of coffee from Ethiopia as a substitute. Yemen began cultivating coffee between 1543 and 1544, strongly promoted by the Ottoman Turkish officials ruling Yemen. The Yemeni coffee industry continued to develop, and by around 1710, Yemen was producing 12,000 and 15,000 tons of coffee annually. In 1573, the Upper German botanist Leonhard Rauwolf began his journey to the east, aiming to find profitable new trade goods from the Orient. Rauwolf was the first to record and bring back specimens of bananas, coffee, dates, and sugarcane from the Middle East to Europe. Another reason for the England's recognition of coffee was its economic benefits. John Houghton, a member of the Royal Society and a pharmacist, was involved in trading tea and coffee. He suggested that coffee trade could boost British exports to other European countries, stimulating the economy in the long term, while also driving consumption of sugar and teaware. Although the Portuguese had rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached India by the late 15th century, the amount of coffee beans transported to Europe via this route during its first 100 years was negligible. Initially, coffee beans entered Europe mainly through land routes to the Mediterranean coast, from where they were shipped to Europe. It was not until 1663 that the Dutch began regularly importing coffee from Yemen directly by sea via the Cape of Good Hope. The widespread cultivation of coffee trees also contributed to the popularization of coffee. In 1616, Dutch merchants successfully brought coffee seedlings from Mocha, Yemen, to Amsterdam and cultivated them. At the same time, multiple attempts to transport tea trees to Europe had failed. Europeans soon realized that the climate was not suitable for large-scale coffee cultivation and sought new planting areas. Around 1730, the Amsterdam market saw coffee from Yemen, Java, Bourbon Island, Suriname, French Saint Domingo, and Martinique. By 1750, more than half of the coffee traded in Amsterdam came from the New World, and in the 18th century, the Dutch also planted coffee trees in Thailand. Before 1780, coffee prices were much lower than tea prices, and after 1790, as tea prices decreased, the price gap between the two narrowed, but coffee prices remained consistently lower than tea prices. In 1715, the French transplanted coffee seedlings from Mocha to Bourbon Island, and by 1719, Bourbon Island had its first coffee harvest. By 1727, the island's coffee production had reached 50 tons, and the colonial government mandated that each person plant 200 coffee trees and imposed severe penalties for cutting down the trees. Similarly, in 1730, the British introduced coffee trees at Jamaica, producing the renowned Blue Mountain coffee. In 1748, the Spanish transplanted coffee trees to Cuba, and coffee quickly spread to Guatemala, Peru, Costa Rica, Venezuela, and Mexico. In 1752, the Portuguese brought coffee trees to Brazil, but coffee cultivation did not flourish until Brazil's independence in 1822. Vast tracts of tropical rainforests were cleared for coffee plantations, and by 1852, Brazil had become the world's largest coffee exporter. Starting in 1860, the United States became the world's largest coffee consumer. By 1920, the United States was consuming 50% of the world's coffee production. Compared to tea, coffee is easier to preserve. After roasting, coffee beans have a moisture content of about 1 to 2%, while dried tea leaves have a moisture content of about 3 to 7%. The low moisture content of coffee reduces the risk of mold and bacteria growth, extending their shelf life, whereas tea leaves are more prone to spoilage during long-distance transport in humid conditions. Moreover, the dense nature of coffee beans increases their weight, necessitating high-capacity transport methods such as trains and ships for cost-effective bulk transportation, especially in the hilly tropical and subtropical regions where transportation infrastructure is often underdeveloped. This need for efficient transport is one of the reasons early coffee cultivation was often near oceans and rivers. In the Buhaya region of southern Kenya, coffee cultivation began in the late 19th century but was initially unprofitable due to poor transportation conditions. Now let's talk about the rise of coffee house culture. Although coffee was initially used in the Arab world for its stimulating effects, it quickly gained strong social attributes. Coffee houses emerged in mid-16th century England, offering an elegant environment, leisurely atmosphere, and rich cultural ambiance, in stark contrast to dimly lit decadent taverns. In 1650, a Lebanese man opened the first coffee house in Western Europe in the university town of Oxford. These coffee houses continued to be open, and these coffee houses were important social places where they were subscribed to newspaper and magazines for customers to read for free, and posted recent commodity prices, stock quotes, and shipping schedules on their walls, even offering foreign publications. These places became a social hub where people could check up on local news and socialize with others. Different coffee houses gradually developed their own areas of expertise, such as finance or shipping, attracting patrons with specific interests. Coffee houses provided a space for individuals to engage in public life, bridging the gap between public opinion and the private world. They served as venues for learning, discussion, reflection, and debate, fostering intellectual exchange and sparking innovative ideas. As mentioned earlier, the first coffee house in Western Europe opened in Oxford and quickly became a favorite spot for students and teachers. The informal and lively discussions in coffee houses sometimes led to significant scientific debates, such as the famous dispute between Newton and Hooke over who proposed the law of universal gravitation. During the Napoleonic Continental blockade, as Britain controlled the sea routes, Vienna received only limited supplies of coffee beans. To sustain their business, coffee house owners diversified by offering pastries, fruit, and hot meals, which evolved into the Vietnamese coffee house model. Now let's talk about technological advances in coffee brewing. The British and French were among the first to discover devices for brewing coffee using high-pressure steam in the early 19th century. Compared to the subsequent rise of tea drinking in Britain, the emergence of coffee houses was closely linked to the development of the times. First, in terms of introduction, coffee was brought to Europe via the Ottoman Empire at the end of the 16th century, earlier than tea, which was traded to Europe by the Dutch and Portuguese in the 17th century. Secondly, in terms of cultural acceptance, coffee was already widely accepted in the Near East and closely interacted with Europe, whereas tea came from the distant East and required a long process of cognition, consumption, acceptance, and promotion. Thirdly, in terms of cost and supply, coffee came from the Middle East and East Africa, providing a stable supply with low transportation costs and minimal trade risks. In contrast, tea mainly came from China, later from India, involving long sea voyages with high risks and significant cost fluctuations. Moreover, in terms of consumer groups, coffee was widely consumed by the public and became a social activity in coffee houses, while tea was initially a luxury and later more concentrated in households, not spreading as widely in public menus. Coffee houses also became increasingly specialized, and unlike the simple preparation of tea with a teapot and hot water, high-end espresso machines were complex and expensive. Purchasing and maintaining such machines at home was often impractical due to the high cost and small scale of use. In terms of business models, tea houses typically operated in two ways. Some only sold brewed tea without tea leaves or refills, which was lighter and less effective than a single cup of coffee, and did not align with the European practice of multiple tea infusions. This made tea houses less popular compared to coffee houses, and other coffee houses provided venue and tea leaves, tea sets, and hot water, allowing for longer stays, often with higher starting price, making it less cost-effective for short visits compared to per-cup coffee consumption. The material differences between tea's multiple infusions and coffee's single brewing became significant once supply chain and cost issues were resolved, and the nature of tea drinking also made it unlikely for someone like Cook to visit over 60 coffee houses in a short period, as previously mentioned. The renowned economist Joseph Alois Schumpeter proposed in 1912 that economic development is essentially an internal process of innovation. This involves the creation of new products, the introduction of production methods, the opening of new raw material markets, and the innovation of business organizational forms, all driven by market forces. Schumpeter's insightful summary accurately captures the characteristic of economic development over the centuries. The products developed in Chapter 2 and 3, such as ginseng, sandalwood, and cotton, all became highly successful market trends driven by constant innovation, and acted as catalysts for globalization, social transformation, and economic growth. In the history of the cotton industry, the first industrial revolution in the 18th century, led by Britain, saw innovations in cotton textile industry that increased productivity by hundreds or even thousands, surpassing India, which has long dominated cotton textile industry. In the history of porcelain, European ceramic technologies independently innovated by Germany's Barker and further developed by France's Francois Xavier de L'Entrepose was successfully applied to large-scale commercial production. This led to the creation of bone china, which surpassed traditional Chinese porcelain. The British, by combining modern industrial techniques, efficiently produced and sold bone china globally, breaking China's 1,500-year monopoly on porcelain technology and capturing the global high-end porcelain market. In tea production, the British, through persistent efforts, established large-scale industrial tea production in Assam, South Asia, overturning China's southern-year dominance in the tea trade. As we have seen in this chapter, scientific and technological exploration is a crucial means of reversing unfavorable situations, transforming from lagging to leading, from ignorance to advancement, from obscurity to civilization, and those who strive against the current in a vast river of history will ultimately achieve success, and those who explore presently in the changing tides of human civilization will undoubtedly leave their mark on history. That's it for this episode. Next week we'll be going over chapter 5, and then we'll be nearing the conclusion of the book. As always, you can purchase this book on Amazon, and if you enjoy these videos, feel free to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and see you next week.